Well, hello, students, and welcome to another review lecture. This time, it's the early modern era, as we've been calling it, the 1450 to 1750 time period, the middle of the three eras that could be part of your exam, which is coming up on Thursday, May 21st. So I hope this is a helpful exercise for you. And of course, the same PowerPoint is available in the same page of OneNote where you found this, if you want to just look at the PowerPoint by itself. But let's get started here with this era, the early modern era. As I just noted, the College Board has for years called this time period the time period of global interactions, which of course makes sense because in this time period, the one big change in human history is the beginning of true globalization, the first time period when humans across oceans and in both hemispheres began sustained interaction with each other. So that's a big deal. The blue era, we use the color blue as our symbol, our symbolic color for the era. And why is that the case? Well, number one, of course, is because of those transoceanic interactions, the maritime revolution that made them possible, and that little rhyme that reminds us of perhaps the most momentous of single voyage in human history. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean. That's right. And here are some Portuguese caravels to remind us about the importance of sailing across the world's blue seas and oceans in this time period. I also think about the bluish tint of gunpowder, too, because this is the time period when gunpowder becomes a usable form of weaponry in many human societies. The gunpowder revolution, if you will, kicks in this time period, too. We'll think of those cobalt blue porcelain glazes on Ming Dynasty vases and other pieces of porcelain that were still a reminder of the importance of luxury goods and world trade in this time period. That's a continuity. The importance of China in the world economy as the world's wealthiest society. That's a continuity too. So maybe we can remember that, the Ming Dynasty, a new dynasty that becomes important in Chinese history and therefore world history in this time period too. There's our silver coin, reminding us that in this time period, those new supplies of silver that are discovered in Japan and in Latin America, in Mexico, and more than anywhere else in Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, provide the world with its new go-to currency of this time period, silver coinage becoming the most common form of money in the world in this time period and helping grease the wheels of global trade. The piece of eight, that is in fact one of those Spanish pieces of eight, the most commonly used currency by the end of this era, one of those silver coins to remember. There's Mary. This happens to be an Italian Renaissance portrait of Mary, the mother of Jesus there, wearing, as she traditionally does in Christian art, the blue veil. So maybe blue can help us to remember, too, the globalization of Christianity in this time period when Christianity becomes, for the first time ever, really, the biggest religion in the world. So that's a big deal. And then we can also remember Copernicus, gazing up at the blue skies here and helping launch what's come to be known the scientific revolution in this time period too. All kinds of blue things here. Oh, and not to forget Martin Luther too. So let's remember this, and the College Board too, as they do the picture of the era. Here we go. This is the one era which I feel like can be embodied too in a single primary source image, and it's this one from the cover of your old red textbooks here, which, as you recall, is a beautiful picture of what's going to turn out to be a very ugly series of events in the end. But there in the middle is Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, recently arrived in Mexico there. He's meeting on the right Moctezuma II, the emperor of the Aztec or Mexica Empire there, headquartered in Tenochtitlan, today's Mexico City. And you can see there's a little exchange of gifts going on there too. So that symbolizes the exchange of all kinds of things between the hemispheres of the world, the continents of the world. There, behind Hernán Cortés, of course, is his enslaved, or no, so not enslaved, his servant Juan Diego from West Africa. Behind him, some more of the Spanish European conquistadors. And there they've got a steel spear there. They've got a horse symbolizing the Columbian Exchange that is about to happen. And as we know, things are not going to go well for the Mexica from here. So this picture also symbolizes the conquest and expansion of empires that are such a key part of this era. So never before has an era been so well embodied in a single image as this one here. So keep this image in mind. Maybe this is your image that should flash into your head when you think about this 1450 to 1750 time period, because of course those Spanish are also going to bring Christianity to the New World. That's part of the globalization of Christianity story. They're bringing gunpowder with them, and of course they're bringing disease with them too, which is going to make their conquest and colonization of the Americas and the inclusion of the Americas in this new globalized world fairly easy for the Spanish to accomplish there after sailing across the ocean blue. The three big pictures, or the three big stories of this era that the College Board wants you to remember, and of course these are always going to be good go-to things for contextualization should you happen to have a DBQ from this era. They are the Maritime Revolution and its many consequences, the new ability of humans to sail across oceans like the Atlantic and Pacific and to easily interconnect continents like Asia, Africa, and Europe. Empire building again. This is a continuity. All three of our eras relate to empire building and the expansion of empires in some way, shape, or form. So that's a go-to story. And this is an interesting one, probably the smallest of these, but it's an interesting story. The way that people work, the changes in how people work. It's still mostly farming, but still some new ways of farming in this time period, and what people do with their products is a change in this era too. Here are the official versions from the College Board of these stories. Key concept 4.1, the interconnection of Eastern and Western hemispheres, Afro-Eurasia and the Americas, made possible by transoceanic voyaging, transformed trade, and had a significant social impact on the world. That's something they want you to know. The Maritime Revolution, well, let's look at this one first, and this is our big story of the era. Why did this happen? Why did humans, first Europeans and then others, gain this ability to sail pretty much anywhere they wanted to in the world? Well, let's keep in mind this was a synthesis, a coming together of previously developed seafaring technology and knowledge, mostly from Asia. So things that already existed. Compasses, of course, invented originally in China by the 13th century. The astrolabe there, which enables you to tell by observing certain stars how far north or south on the globe you are, and that came from Arab Muslim civilization. And then there we have on that Portuguese ship, we've got the lateen sails, first developed thousands of years ago for navigation in the Indian Ocean basin. And all this coming together with some new skills, maps making skills from those societies, plus European map making skills. That happens to be a famous European map from right before Columbus's voyages, so you can see it only shows Africa, Asia, and Europe. So all of these older technologies coming together, being adopted by European sailors and mariners, and then joined with a new understanding gained by those European sailors first and then others about some other environmental phenomena of our entire globe that they came to understand as they began venturing further out. Here's our map of the wind patterns and also the current patterns. And this is the fun map here that shows us how it was that the Portuguese learned to use, in this case, largely the current patterns to sail very quickly around the southern tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean, right? By riding those sort of circulating currents of the Atlantic Ocean quickly, riding the currents all the way out from the coast of Africa there, south of the equator, and quickly into the Indian Ocean. So let's keep that in mind too. That synthesis of previously developed seafaring technology and knowledge, the compass, the astrolabe, the lateen sails, the map making, with an improved understanding of global wind and current patterns, especially on the part of the Europeans. Those trade winds and westerlies, the westeries in the middle latitudes, and the trade winds around the equator, blowing in opposite directions in most parts of the world, most parts of the globe, the Atlantic and the Pacific. The one place where they kind of get messed up and the monsoon winds matter more, of course, are the Indian Ocean. But you guys know that if you figure out what latitudes the winds blow which ways, then it becomes relatively easy to sail across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And this maritime revolution, this new ability to sail such long distances across the oceans, had profound effects for the life of humans in every part of the world. Existing regional patterns of trade intensified in the context of new global circulation of goods. Humans figure out how to get things, everything from spices and ivory to sugar and cotton, from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world. And this global trade also promotes the regional trade that had been happening already. And one good example for us of this is Southeast Asia. I mean, long before the year 1200, Southeast Asia, a great producer of the world's spices, coriander and nutmeg and cinnamon, had gotten wealthy from trading these spices to other parts of Afro-Eurasia, even before 1200 and certainly before the year 1450. And of course, when the whole world is connected after the year 1450 by the Maritime Revolution, this demand for spices merely increases. So places like Malacca, the great trading city in present-day Malaysia on the Malay Peninsula, become even more wealthy and even more involved in trade. So those local Malay rulers who'd profited from the spice trade before the year 1200 had already, by 1450, you'll recall, been joined by Chinese merchants. There's the old Chinese temple you can still visit today in Malacca, and Muslim merchants from Arabia and Persia had already shown up there by the year 1450. So a lot of traders already in Malacca, and they're joined after 1450 or so by new merchants, the Portuguese who built this fort there, the remains of which you can still visit today in Malacca. And eventually, as you might recall, the city of Malacca became a Dutch trading post owned by the Dutch East India Company. They built this church here in the 1600s, just going to show how local regional trade in Southeast Asia intensified. More and more people were joining in the spice trade of Southeast Asia, even as trade globalized. So the Indian Ocean Trade Network is a good example of this phenomenon of regional trade patterns intensifying, even as trade goes global. Other effects. Some older trade networks did see disruption and decline. And one example of that for us, we know from the 1200 to 1450 time period that one of our four great trade networks of that era for the Afro-Eurasian part of the world was the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. Well, as this trading map here shows, this happens to be an illustration of that most tragic of all human trade stories, the slave trade. As this trade map shows, Trans-Saharan trade did continue into the 1450 to 1750 time period. I mean, you can still see there's lines there indicating camel caravans crossing the Sahara Desert, but much less so than the maritime trade. It became much easier to get goods, and in this case, human beings, to Europe and to the Mediterranean area by ship sailing around West Africa. So the trans-Saharan trade routes decline quite a bit. So too, even more so, to the Silk Roads, as it becomes easier to sail a ship from Europe and the Mediterranean all the way to East Asia rather than to take a long and arduous camel caravan journey across the Silk Roads. So let's remember that one of the effects of the shift to maritime trade worldwide is the decline of some of these older land-based trade networks. So the Portuguese they deserve special attention here in our story of the Maritime Revolution and really the story of the modern era. That's why the very last DBQ review that you get to do involves the Portuguese. So let's remember what they did. They used some of the new technologies of sailing developed in Europe, like caravels. These sorts of ships you see here that combine the versatility, the ability to tack into the wind of those triangular lateen sails with the power provided by square sails. Because when you're sailing with the wind, as they learned to do in the trade winds and westerlies, it's pretty effective to just put up those square sails that catch a maximum amount of wind and ride those wind currents as fast as you can. So caravels and maritime cannons developed by the Portuguese and other Europeans. Uniquely, in the 15th century, in fact, in the early 1400s, you'll recall perhaps the story of Prince Henry the Navigator, the son of King John of Portugal, who decided that since Portugal wasn't going to amount to much just on its own, being a sliver of rocky, dirty soil on the edge of Europe, Portugal was only going to prosper if they could somehow take to the sea and tap into the trade routes of the rest of the world. And so it was that Prince Henry the Navigator used some government funding to start that navigation school there at Sagres on the southern coast of Portugal to make Portuguese sailors into the world's best mariners and to launch Portugal, no pun intended, into an era of greatness by sea. And his idea of teaching Portuguese sailors how to use all this technology and read the maps and, in short, to be able to navigate as far as they possibly could, quickly bore results because, as you know, by the year 1498, the Portuguese, led by Vasco da Gama, had indeed made their way and succeeded in sailing all the way, not only to the great rich trading ports of West Africa, but all the way around Africa and into the Indian Ocean, where they began their career as key players in Indian Ocean trade and indeed the trade of the entire world. And here's just a reminder, of course, that there was lots of good stuff to be had in the Indian Ocean and East Asia, and the Portuguese were the first Europeans to get there, to get the silk and lacquerware from Japan, to get the tea from China, to get the pepper from India and the cotton cloth from India, to get the cinnamon from South and Southeast Asia. They made it there first from Europe, and that helped the Portuguese to launch a very small and insignificant country into a place of great prominence in world history for a while. Because once they arrived and once that showed up, or once it proved that they had some key technologies that others in the area lacked, no one with a dhow had a maritime cannon at that point, not only could they show up, but they could take over. At least they could take over a lot of the key ports around the coast of Africa and the coasts of the Indian Ocean and all the way into East Asia too. What do we call this kind of arrangement here? Where there, as you can see on the map, they're not conquering a lot of territory on land, but they are taking over a lot of the key trading posts, trading ports. It is, of course, a trading post empire. And with this trading post empire, with their control of dozens of cities, dozens of ports around the shores of Africa and Asia and the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese become key players in world trade and make Portugal a pretty rich and pretty powerful place for a while. So let's keep that in mind. This one form of imperialism here, this trading post empire. Now, it had been the Portuguese goal once they showed up to not only participate in Indian Ocean trade, but to totally dominate it, to control it entirely, to monopolize trade in spices and textiles and silks and all that other good stuff. And of course, the sea was just too vast, and there weren't ever that many Portuguese there because there aren't that many Portuguese people to begin with. So they didn't dominate trade. They didn't control it, at least, you know, no more than half of it at a particular time, probably, they say most historians. But they did give them a big role in this trade network through a combination of several factors. Force, right? Those maritime cannons, some would say piracy, and many contemporary accounts do describe the way the Portuguese attacked rival ships and rival ports just like pirates. And also some clever alliances. And you can see here, this is one of my favorite primary source pictures from history, is that Portuguese gentleman on the right there with his South Asian servant holding the umbrella for him, about to make a clever alliance with that woman there from a local South Asian merchant family. Because, of course, when you marry into the trading families of South Asia, they're much more likely to do business with you. And no small number of Portuguese merchants did exactly that. One reason why a surprisingly large number of families in places like Sri Lanka today have Portuguese last names, like Anuk Fernando from my third period class about 3 years ago. So that's kind of interesting too. Right next to Portugal, of course, was Spain, another new country that had just recently succeeded in unifying their territory after kicking out the ruling Arabs that had long ruled Al-Andalus, or the Iberian Peninsula. And this new country of Spain did something very different with the Maritime Revolution. You remember the story of the Italian sailor who showed up at the Portuguese court and said, "Hey, we all know the world is round. I think I can get to Asia by going west across the Atlantic." And of course, the well-educated Portuguese who knew all about sailing said, that's crazy. It's 10,000 miles from here across the ocean to China, which was true. And about the dumber Spanish monarchs who said, all right, and gave him some money and some ships, and off he went. And sure enough, 3,000 miles later, he found, well, the Caribbean. And thus began the transatlantic voyages. Of course, Christopher Columbus was one of the few people who didn't realize that he had found not Asia or India, but an entirely new set of continents. He died, went to his grave believing he had sailed to Asia, but everyone else quickly figured out, ooh, this is a new place. And it looks like it could be interesting. In 1492, of course, is when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And that, of course, launched this massive exchange between the Afro-Eurasian world and the Americas, which we now call the Columbian Exchange. And this is something the College Board really, really likes you to know about, this exchange of species of animals and plants and pathogens, too, between these two previously isolated from each other chunks of our planet. And there's a kind of a good summary for you there in visual form of all the plants, animals, and pathogens that went from the Americas east to Afro-Eurasia, and the plants, animals, and pathogens that went west from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas, with profound effects for both of them. So we are going to spend a little bit of time here on the Columbian Exchange and its key components here. The most devastating of which undoubtedly were the diseases. This was a two-way street. There were, according to most historians who study this, some diseases like syphilis, the sexually transmitted disease, that went from the Americas to Europe. But the most devastating ones went the other way, from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. And the one that you really want to remember here, even in our time period of pandemics, is smallpox, and how that led to a demographic collapse in the Americas, that over the period of about a century or so, somewhere between 50 and 90% of the population of the Americas was killed by this disease, to which Amerindian people had had no exposure, and to which they therefore had no immunities prior to its arrival with European explorers. And of course, the amount of disruption caused by Amerindian societies and the amount of devastation to the population, that's what paved the way for European conquest and colonization of the Americas in very short order after their arrival. Jared Diamond, of course, reminds us too about the guns and steel role there too, but germs were critical in the story of conquest of the Americas. Again, there's a note that it probably was a two-way street there too, but it was the Americas by far that received the most devastating effects of these diseases. The new European arrivals brought with them some domesticated animals as well, some large domesticated animals that we should pay attention to, and I think probably horses and cattle are the two to remember. We'll remember how horses and cattle transformed the environment of the grasslands of North and South America. The arrival of horses, who are faster than bison, coincides with the decline of bison, or as they're often called, buffalo, for example, in the Great Plains region of North America. The horses arrive and the bison population begins to decline. And that's partly perhaps because the horses are out competing the bison for their food source, the grass, but also probably even more so because of the way that the humans living there, people like the Apache, the Dakota, the Navajo, Amerindian people, adopted these domesticated animals, the ones who didn't become wild horses, and became more nomadic and more pastoral. The Dakota, for example, had made a living largely by farming in what's now Minnesota and North Dakota and South Dakota. But when the horses arrived, suddenly they had the capability to keep up with and catch and use buffalo or bison as a reliable food source. So they actually kind of gave up on some of the farming they'd been doing and relied on hunting instead. Kind of one of the strange episodes of history of humans actually moving from farming to hunting and gathering, which is not the usual direction. Sheep were introduced in what's now the American Southwest. So people there, like the Navajo people, adopted pastoralism, herding sheep, over previous ways of life. So that was a big change too. And the ability of large parts of North America and South America to sustain large domesticated animals like cattle led to an economic transformation too. So large parts of Mexico, of what's now Argentina, of what's now North America, became ranching areas because cattle back then were pretty valuable, not for their meat, which you couldn't ship very well before refrigeration, but for their leather and their hides. So ranching becomes a big part of the economy in the Americas following colonization. Our third species you want to remember from the Columbian Exchange is sugar, both because of its environmental impact and its economic impact, and I guess I should add too its sociological impact too, which was huge. Here was this domesticated crop, first domesticated in South Asia before the year 1200, and then spread throughout the Muslim world by the year 1450, which is brought over and introduced to places like tropical Brazil and the Caribbean, where it grows better than anywhere else on earth, as it turns out. And very quickly, sugar farming, sugar plantations become a key part of the economy in the Americas and transform the diet of the world. I always think this is a fun factoid. Forensic anthropologists, the guys who study dead bodies to see what they can tell us about human history, they point out that most human remains from before the year 1500 or so have pretty good teeth. Cavities don't become a widespread human problem until after the year 1500, when the introduction of sugar to the Americas provides a vast supply of this dangerous food and gives us bad teeth. Sugar was one of the great prosperity generators of the 1450 to 1750 time period. If you could grow this stuff, people wanted to buy it. So some people in the world and some societies in the world got rich by controlling the production and distribution of sugar beginning in the Americas. And you can tell the person in this picture who looks rich is the guy who A, is wearing a top hat because that's the international symbol of I'm rich, and B, gets to be on a horse in the shade while everybody else is working. But of course, this labor-intensive crop, as we shall see, condemned millions of other humans to slavery to facilitate its production. And that's a part of the story we'll get to in a moment. And of course, too, sugar is a demanding crop. It takes quite a toll on the soil and the land on which it's farmed, especially if it's planted over and over and over again for centuries, as was the case in coastal Brazil and the Caribbean. And by the year 1750 or so, had already taken quite a toll on the soil and the productivity of those areas. I mean, take a look at this picture of present-day Haiti, which of course was at one time the great French sugar-growing colony called Saint-Domingue. Even today, the environmental effects on Haiti of deforestation, the forests that were cut down to make way for sugar plantations, and soil exhaustion leave a lot of Haiti looking like this, unable to sustain farmland or even forest land any longer, even in the 21st century. And that pattern is repeated throughout the sugar-growing areas of the Americas. Fourth Columbian Exchange things we should remember, the fourth set here. Two species of of plants that went from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia, potatoes and maize, or as we call it here in America, corn. And why are these so important? Because they're amazing crops. Both of them can produce a ton of good carbohydrates, and in the case of maize, a decent amount of protein, and in the case of potatoes, a decent amount of vitamins, just about anywhere. These are very hardy crops. You can grow maize in all kinds of climates. Potatoes you can grow almost anywhere, all the way from Alaska to tropical places like Thailand. Potatoes will grow. No wonder when these sources of food were introduced to Afro-Eurasia, they really took off and became widespread parts of the Afro-Eurasian diet. By the year 1750 or so, some historians estimate that 20% of the calories eaten on Earth were from these American crops that were introduced to the rest of the world as part of the Columbian Exchange. And historians believe that this introduction of American foods to the rest of the world were a key part of the massive population growth, which begins by the year 1750 or so, by the end of the early modern era. And there you can see it there on the chart that human population growth kind of shifts from being arithmetic to geometric because of the introduction of Columbian Exchange American crops to the rest of the world. Now, we focus a lot on the voyages of Columbus and the other Spanish conquistadors who came and those who came after them kind of in the tropics, but it is worth noting here, especially on behalf of our Canadian friends, the way that that voyages across the North Atlantic, which happened very quickly after Columbus's voyages too, played a key role in human history and especially the history of the Americas. There on the top is John Cabot's ship, or rather a reconstruction of John Cabot's ship. John Cabot, of course, was really Giovanni Caboto, another one of those Italian sailors. A lot of good sailors in Italy as it happened. You know, they learned how to sail on the Mediterranean Sea as part of the Mediterranean trade routes, which were also a thing in both the 1200 to 1450 time period and the 1450 to 1750 time period. And Giovanni Caboto was another one of those Italian sailors who thought that you could get to other parts of the world by sailing west across the Atlantic. And he convinced the King of England, King Henry VII, to give him some funding, which King Henry VII did, and he sailed across and found Canada, yay! Which turned out not to have any precious resources or spices, but did have a lot of fish, like cod. And that's why the first sort of global participation of North America in a global economy was part of the cod industry, whereby European fishers would sail across the Atlantic Ocean to the rich cod fishing grounds off of what's now Newfoundland and New England and Atlantic Canada. And in fact, the first European settlements in North America were little villages set up by European fishermen like St. John's, Newfoundland, to be bases for the fishing industry. They did think, those early explorers, that perhaps they could find a sea route, find a way to sail through North America to get to Asia. The Northwest Passage, they called it. That they did not find that because it didn't really exist south of the Arctic. But it did, these early North Atlantic voyages, spearhead and lead to the French and British settlement of colonization and the colonization of North America, which is why we are here in the United States and Canada speaking primarily English and primarily French if you live here today. So that's an interesting part of the story too. And if you ever want to read a good book about fish, I'll just remind you about Cod, The History of the Fish That Changed the World by Mark Kurlansky. It's a good book. All of this, all these voyages helped set up what came to be called the Atlantic system, this new set of trade routes crisscrossing the Atlantic Ocean, turning what had been an uncrossable barrier in human society and human history to one of the busiest trade networks in human history in this 1450 to 1750 time period. And you can see here the kinds of things, often the trade routes were referred to as triangular trade routes, though really they were a set of interconnecting triangles. And you can see here the kind of manufactured goods shipped from Europe to both the Americas and Africa. You can see the kind of raw materials and goods like fish and furs and sugar shipped from the Americas back to Europe or to Africa, and then the traffic in some goods like gold and ivory from West Africa to Europe, and the tragic trafficking of human beings from Africa to the Americas, represented all as parts of this Atlantic system trade network. All of which arose in the context of some new economic phenomena and thinking. So we'll spend a little time on that. Mercantilism, commercialization, and the new globalized economy, which sprang forth from the Maritime Revolution too. Mercantilism is a term the College Board wants you to know. It's an important one to know here in world history. And remember, this is an economic policy in which a nation seeks to maximize its wealth and power by maximizing its supply of bullion, precious metals like gold and silver. And this is an idea that arose and was especially popular amongst European leaders in this time period. And it does kind of make sense that the more money you have, the more powerful your state is going to be, because you're going to be able to buy more ships and more cannon and hire more soldiers. So how do you maximize your supply of money, of bullion? Well, a big idea that became popular in this time period was to get colonies to provide you with wealth and to exploit them. And this, of course, was a big driving factor in the European colonization of the Americas. And also to somehow sell more to other states than you buy from them, to find the kind of stuff that other people, especially other Europeans, want to buy from you, and then to sell it to them. Stuff like sugar. There's an easy way to do mercantilism, of course, if your goal is just to get as much gold or silver as you can. Here's the easy way. And the Spanish, when they managed to conquer the Inca Empire and thereby gain control of what's now Bolivia, and discovered that there had been a small-scale mining operation there getting silver out of the biggest silver deposit ever discovered by humans on our planet, there at Potosi, the Spanish were able to do it the easy way, which was to literally dig the stuff up out of the ground. And that's why the Spanish piece of 8, which was produced by the Spanish government, became such a widespread coin. The Spanish had most of the world's silver at that time. And having all this silver, having all this coinage, of course, made it easy for everyone to do business with money instead of just trading, and further promoted trade and globalization of trade in this time period. The slightly harder way to do mercantilism, if you weren't Spain, or Japan, by the way, which also discovered it had some pretty boss silver deposits on its islands. But if you weren't Spain or Japan, the slightly harder way to do mercantilism was this: to produce cash crops, ideally in your colonies, stuff that other states would want to buy from you. And that's why cash crop production became key to the economies of European overseas empire. Tobacco in places like Virginia, indigo in places like Bermuda in the Atlantic Ocean, a British colony, cotton in India, which was more or less controlled by the British East India Company, certain parts of it towards the end of our era. But most of all, the #1 cash crop to remember of this time period, which is, of course, sugar. The kind of sugar grown there on Antigua in this primary source picture here from the Caribbean. And because of this emphasis on plantation, or on cash crop production, plantation economies became sort of the dominant form of life, of economic life in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in the southern colonies of North America, in short, much of the American colonies of the European empires. And of course, to work on that kind of intensive production of cash crops, which plantation economies involve, you need a lot of labor. And if you're trying to maximize your profits and follow this policy of mercantilism, then what's a better policy to follow than to not pay your workers? And this, of course, is why the slave trade system rose to its greatest prominence yet in world history during this 1450 to 1750 time period, this era of cash crop production and plantation farming. And we're going to look, of course, at the Atlantic slave trade, probably the most profound instance of trafficking of human beings in human history, certainly so far. The Atlantic slave trade, which in this era and into the next era, into the 19th century, involved the transfer of somewhere between 9 and 12 million African captives to the Americas, most of them coming from West Africa and Central Africa, most of them winding up in the Caribbean islands and in Brazil between the 1500s to the 1830s. And this slave trade became a critical part of the world economy. In some ways, this new slave trade system was a continuity, showed continuity from earlier times, from before 1450. For one thing, the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trade, which had happened before 1450, continued. There was still a demand for enslaved captives, especially in the Middle East. And so there still were captives who were dragged across the Sahara Desert by camel caravan, or chained in the hulls of dhows and brought up the East African coast on the the Indian Ocean trade networks. Those aspects of slave trade still continued into our time period. So did the practice of household slavery, this kind of system we read about back in December as we read the autobiography of Olaudah Equiano, where human beings would be technically enslaved, but treated more as household servants in the households of their owners, working in the fields, for example, alongside their owners on farms, or doing household chores. So that was a thing that still continued in Afro-Eurasia and in Africa itself. But the Atlantic slave trade brought many changes to West and Central Africa. So let's pay attention to these changes. It was on a much wider scale, a much vaster scale, involving far more human beings than the earlier Trans-Saharan or Indian Ocean slave trade. And as a result, and especially as a result of the fact that those European slave traders who brought captives across the Atlantic favored male captives over female captives. This brought great disruption to West African societies. Families were broken up. You'll remember Olaudah Equiano never saw his parents or his siblings again after he was sold into the slave system. A great gender imbalance arose with far more females than males left behind in West and Central Africa. So all kinds of societal disruption there. There were a lot of West African and Central African states that prospered from participation in the Atlantic slave trade, like the Ashanti Empire, one of the states that arose in West Africa in our time period. This picture here is a primary photo or primary picture from the 18th century from Dahomey, a West African state whose leaders jumped enthusiastically into the slave trade. And this happens to be a welcoming ceremony where the king of Dahomey is welcoming British officials and slave merchants to his society so he can do business with them and continue to prosper from participation in the slave trade. But this was not true of all West African, Central African leaders or their states. At times, many African leaders resisted participation in the slave trade. This was the stance of the great Central African Kingdom of Congo for a long time, that its leaders actively resisted and tried their best to protect their subjects from being caught up in the Atlantic slave trade system. So a diversity of effects and a diversity of reactions to the Atlantic slave trade there in West Africa. It had, this African or Atlantic slave trade system, of course, a profound impact on the Americas in our 1450 to 1750 time period, and continues to until this day, as all kinds of traditions and foods like okra were brought to the Americas by those West and Central African captives. In fact, we know that captives played their part in this Columbian exchange, this transfer of species as well, because some of the food crops that we still enjoy in the Americas today were initially brought to our shores by West African and Central African captives during this time period. Okra, that seed pod that we can eat and enjoy in some cuisine here in the America, like gumbo from Louisiana, and foods from the Caribbean arrived with captives at this time period. The religious traditions, there are a number of religious traditions that developed in the Americas, syncretic traditions that mixed together West African beliefs, Central African beliefs, with European beliefs, or beliefs brought by the Europeans, but specifically Catholic Christianity. And some religious historians think some of the Native American or Amerindian beliefs that West African peoples encountered here too as well, to create these new syncretic belief systems like Vodun in what's now Haiti, and Candomblé in Brazil, which combines specifically Roman Catholic beliefs in certain saints and the role of the Virgin Mary, for example, with Yoruba traditions from West Africa. So good to remember some of those examples. Musical traditions too. A lot of the musical traditions of the Americas, from reggae and jazz and blues in North America to samba in South America. Musicologists trace back a lot of the musical elements of those traditions to West and Central African musical traditions. Let's take a look now, too, at how mercantilism, this goal of making as much cash money as you can, also influenced economic developments in the terms of the ways that companies were set up. Kind of a new thing in world history in this time period, companies or corporations. And if you're going to remember only one company or corporation from this time period, it's probably this one, whose emblem you can see here on this coin. This was a company so powerful, it had made its own money, and I don't mean it earned money, I mean it literally produced its own cash currency that people accepted around the world, and it is, of course, the VOC. They also owned this trading ship here. You can see here the key example of the European Joint Stock Company, a company owned by stockholders who would buy a stock or a share, who would own a small portion of that company, and these joint stock companies, financed by sales of little bits of themselves, of shares of themselves to investors, they become key players in world trade, these European joint stock companies. And of course, the one you want to remember is the Dutch East India Company, the owner of that ship at the top and the producer of that coin at the bottom, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, as they say in Dutch, or the VOC. Also important, I think, to remember the British East India Company, chartered by the British government. It was King James I that gave them permission to form a company, and funded by sales of their stock to investors that rose to prominence in this time period. Remember that these trading companies often made money by transporting goods from place to place. They were, if you will, the UPS or the postal service, if you will, of the time period. So that Dutch East India Company ship might raise money for the company by buying a load of spices in Java, sailing to China, selling the spices there, loading up on silk, sailing to India, selling the silk there, sailing back to Java with some cotton cloth. That's how they made their money, was a lot by carrying goods from place to place, but also gained direct rule increasingly over trading post cities like Malacca, which is our go-to great example of a trading post city in this time period. Once again, Malacca, even by the year 1450, Chinese and Persian and Arab Muslim merchants were active in Malacca alongside the local Malay merchants. The Portuguese show up and take over Malacca in the 1500s, and in the 1600s, Malacca is taken over, as we noted earlier, by the Dutch East India Company and becomes a trading post city owned and operated by the Dutch East India Company. So all of these interactions, the Atlantic slave trade, the transoceanic voyages, the operations of the great trading companies of the time period, all lead to intensified global interaction, both within and between hemispheres and regions. So how does all this affect the world's culture? We've talked about this a bit in the context of the Atlantic slave trade. Let's zoom out even more and look at some of the cultural changes happening in this time period, which I think we can summarize pretty clearly in 3 points. First of all, existing religions spread to new parts of the world. Secondly, existing religions were reformed. We'll see a good example of that. And as we've seen already with the examples of Vodun and Candomblé, humans created new syncretic belief systems and practices, mixing together the beliefs and rituals that had come from one part of the world with beliefs and rituals in the new part of the world and creating something new. So let's look at some examples of that. Let's start with the important story in this time period of existing religions spreading to new places. Here, of course, we have this image of Juan Diego and the Virgin of Guadalupe there on his tilma, or his cloak that he's holding there with these roses that he's about to miraculously show to the new bishop of Mexico City and convince the bishop that indeed a new church should be built for this new apparition of this old holy figure, Mary, the mother of Jesus, now in a new form, the very Amerindian-looking Virgin of Guadalupe. So let's remember the globalization of Christianity, the way that millions of people in Spain and Portugal's colonies in Latin America adopt this new faith, how millions of people in the Philippines, which becomes a Spanish colony in this time period in Southeast Asia, adopt Catholic Christianity. Let's remember how Islam, the spread of Islam is a very big story in the 1200 to 1450 time period, and that continues into this time period as well. Islam gains more followers in sub-Saharan Africa, especially the Sahel region of West Africa, and continues to spread throughout what's now Indonesia in Southeast Asia. And it's often due to those Sufis, those religious missionaries of the Muslim world who believed in kind of a flexible and welcoming version of Islam and were able to convince a lot of people to join their faith. Second story of culture, let's remember how existing religions were reformed. And probably our best example of this in this time period is the movement that literally had the word reform in its name. The Reformation, the addition, spearheaded by this dude, Martin Luther, of a third major sect to the world of Christianity, Protestant Christianity, arising out of the protests of Martin Luther and other leaders against the Catholic Church in Western Europe. And in fact, ultimately, though it wasn't Martin Luther's intention to do so, leading to a split between the Protestant and Catholic versions of Christianity, now leading to the world of Christianity we have today, with the Orthodox sect, the Catholic sect, and the Protestant sect, three major sects of Christianity. Protestantism, of course, teaching a more personal relationship with God, less of a need for clergy to be your intermediary between you and God. That was one of the big teachings of Martin Luther. It was facilitated the spread of these new ideas more so than it had been in early centuries. Martin Luther wasn't the first guy to criticize the Catholic hierarchy in Western Europe, but thanks to the recent reinvention of the printing press in Western Europe, he was able to spread these ideas, these Protestant ideas, fairly quickly around, and more millions of people adopted his new Protestant form of Christianity. This led in the short term to some trouble, of course, because people like to argue and fight about religious beliefs. Human history teaches us this. Even within the same religion, people like to argue and fight about their religious beliefs. And you'll recall that many of the conflicts within Europe itself in this time period, like the 30 Years' War, which lasted, wait for it, 30 years from 1618 to 1648, drew on this new conflict between Protestant areas and Catholic areas to fuel what was at that time the worst conflict in European history up until the World Wars. So conflict like this, and this is a primary source painting of a battle during these religious wars here, this ongoing conflict. And this wasn't just Europe that this was happening in. There were other parts of the world too where there was ongoing armed conflict between followers of the same religion, but different sects of that religion. For example, within the world of Islam, you'll remember that the Sunni Ottoman Empire and the Shiite Safavid Empire in Persia or Iran fought a long series of wars with each other. And one of the big reasons for this, they said at the time, was because each of them was following the wrong kind of Islam and therefore needed to be defeated. So religious strife here. Third story, take another quick look at this, the creation of new syncretic belief systems and practices. Key examples of this, of course, candomblé and voodoo, which we already discussed in the context of the Atlantic slave trade. Sikhism, one of the world's newest religions, develops in this time period, drawing on some beliefs from Hinduism, some beliefs from Islam, some new ideas too. Sikhism, this monotheistic religion that nevertheless continues a lot of the worship practices of Hinduism as well. Important to remember, this is an example of new syncretic traditions, along, of course, with the development of the syncretic religious traditions within Catholic Christianity, like the worship of the Virgin of Guadalupe, who, you might recall, is also kind of low-key a new version of the Aztec or Mexica mother goddess that they used to worship at the exact same site where the great church for the Virgin of Guadalupe now stands outside of Mexico City. Here's our second big story of the era, key concept 4.2. And just as a reminder, empires, the expansion of empires, the consolidation of empires, the administration of empires remains a big part of the story in this time period too. Empires achieved increased scope and influence around the world, shaping and being shaped by the diverse populations they incorporated, the College Board tells us, and this is very much true. Though there are both old traditional kinds of empires in this time period and kind of a new version of empires, actually a couple new versions of empires in this time period. So let's take a look at that. We do have some old traditional land-based empires, many of them in this time period ruled by Muslim rulers. The Ottoman Empire, the most important of the empires in the Muslim world there in the Middle East and Mediterranean regions, North Africa and into Europe. The smaller but important Safavid Empire there, the latest in a long series of dynasties or empires ruling Persia or Iran, and in South Asia, the Mughal Empire. The one of these three where Muslim rulers ruled over a non-Muslim majority, as we'll be reminded in just a moment. But the biggest of all of these, of course, was the new Qing Dynasty Empire, or Manchu Empire, that arose in this time period, the last of the great Chinese dynasties in East Asia. Land-based empires, all of them. But let's remember, too, the new role played in world history by maritime empires, or transoceanic empires, empires that stretch literally across oceans. And in this case, the College Board wants you to remember that that Britain and Spain and France and Portugal and the Netherlands, all by the year 1750, controlled colonies in other parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Africa, the Americas, thus making them maritime or transoceanic empires. The first time in world history we see this particular form of imperialism. So we'll take a little look at some of the key players here, some things to know about some of these empires. Let's start with the biggest land-based empire here, the Manchu Empire, or Qing Dynasty China, two names for the same thing. There's Kangxi, the great early Manchu emperor of the 18th century. This is, as sometimes happens in Chinese history, a dynasty founded by invaders, the same way those invading Mongols in the 13th century founded the new Yuan dynasty. Here come some other invaders from Manchuria, that sort of chicken head part of China on the map there. Not Han Chinese. These are not ethnically Chinese people who invaded in the 1600s, overthrew the Ming dynasty as it had decayed and fallen into some trouble, and established a new Qing dynasty in China, and add a whole bunch of territory to the lands they rule. Now, in some cases, these new rulers of China implemented some discrimination against the Han Chinese majority that they now ruled. Han Chinese people were not allowed to marry Manchus, for example, but for the most part, the Manchus do assimilate to Chinese culture and society and ways of government. So that's worth noting, too. Let's go to South Asia here. Of course, our South Asian empire to remember for this time period, here represented by Akbar the Great there up on the top of this picture in that pavilion, is the Mughal Empire. And just like anybody who rules South Asia, the job of the Mughals, their chief challenge, their chief task is managing the diverse ethnic and religious groups in India. And for a long time, they do this fairly skillfully and successfully with a policy of religious toleration. Muslims are never more than a quarter of the population in the Mughal Empire. So wise rulers like Akbar the Great decide, well, we got to welcome everybody in. He allows Hindus and others to gain high status in his empire. He even encourages the ruling Mughal Muslims to intermarry with elite Hindu families too, and that works pretty well. However, later rulers like Aurangzeb, who you might recall as having a wrong idea for how to maintain an empire, decide, no, we want to be more strict and orthodox about Islam. How about we knock down the Hindu temples? How about we strip Hindus out of all their government-sponsored jobs? And of course, that works about as well as you'd expect in a Hindu-majority society, and that's kind of when the empire begins to decline there, too, with these less tolerant policies. We're going to continue here to the west, to the next door Safavid Empire in Persia, or what's now Iran. Hey, look at that. It's the Blue Mosque in Isfahan, the great capital city the Safavids built. It's another blue thing from this era. Those Safavids really like building their monumental architecture with blue tiles. So it is one in a long line of Persian dynasties, really stretching back thousands of years. The emperors or shahs of the Safavid Empire, they did claimed their religious legitimacy by saying, we are the defenders of the true version of Islam, the Shia version, the descendants of Ali, the rightful successors to Muhammad. And that was their claim to legitimacy, that they deserve to have power and rule as the defenders of Shia Islam. That, of course, helped fuel their long conflict with the even bigger empire next door, the Ottoman one, whose rulers were Sunni, Check out that massive armament there. There to remind us some key things about the Ottoman Empire, originally founded before 1450 by Ottoman Turks who came from Central Asia. Everyone came from Central Asia. I guess Central Asia just wasn't that great of a place to be there. The Mughals came from there too originally. But anyway, the Ottoman Turks out of Central Asia, they'd already established themselves a pretty nice kingdom in what's now Turkey before 1450. And in 1453, they finally defeated and conquered the last remnants of the Roman or Byzantine Empire by defeating and taking control of Constantinople, now Istanbul, in 1453, using massive cannonry like this to bring down the walls and win those battles. The Ottomans, like the Mughals, had a policy of religious and cultural tolerance to a large degree. There's that church built in Kosovo in Southeast Europe in the Balkans region during Ottoman rule to remind you of how tolerant the Ottomans were in general, with some restrictions of their Christian and Jewish subjects as well. And the Ottomans were the masters of some very interesting forms of state control in this time period. There's the Süleymaniye Mosque there, built in Istanbul in the lower right, to remind you that Ottoman rulers were very good at using monumental architecture, these massive structures built and designed to impress you with how powerful they were as a way of inspiring awe and loyalty, both in the people that they ruled and awe in their enemies too, perhaps, as well. Monumental architecture. Other interesting forms of state control, the way the Ottoman rulers were able to build and control such a large empire so successfully, so for so many centuries, is these guys here. Who are these guys? The Janissaries, of course, professional soldiers. The Ottomans were one of the first societies in human history to hire soldiers and pay them decent wages, give them medical care, give them uniforms to wear. These were good ideas that turned the Janissaries into well-trained, loyal, fierce warriors on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan. And of course, many of these Janissaries were originally recruited from this other interesting form of state control, the famous devshirme system, which you can see here, the way that the Ottoman rulers would tax Christian families in the Balkans of Europe, their boys. And that these boys would be recruited or taken from their families at a young age and raised in special schools and trained to be personally loyal to the Sultan, so that if the Sultan's other elites, like the Turkish aristocrats, got uppity, he could rely on the Janissaries to be personally loyal to him. And some of them also trained to be the bureaucrats who helped administer and build the infrastructure, collect the taxes, administer the laws of the Ottoman Empire as well. So devshirme, an interesting system in world history developed by the Ottoman sultans. Let's not forget, of course, the new maritime empires too in this time period. There they are again, those Western European states whose mastery of guns, germs, and steel allowed them to colonize the Americas and other parts of the world too, Southeast Asia, parts of the African coast. And there are key similarities, really, between both the maritime empires and the land-based empires too. Oh, and let's not forget the trading post empire of the Portuguese. What are some of the key similarities? Well, both of these, the land and the maritime empires, built with the help of gunpowder weaponry, including cannons. The Qing dynasty rulers had gunpowder, the Mughals had it, the Ottomans had it, and so, of course, too, did the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British and the French as they went out conquering new parts of the world. All of these empires relied on bureaucratic elites, literate officials of the government, that could help to collect the taxes and make sure the laws were followed and that the infrastructure was maintained. And military professionals too, professional soldiers to ensure centralized control of these empires, whether it was the Spanish Empire in the Americas or the Safavid Empire in the Middle East. They all relied on these. Here's our primary source from the Qing dynasty, finally, example of this, these young men taking the civil service exam in the Manchu Empire in hopes of gaining that high status and pay as bureaucrats, as civil servants who will then help administer and control the Chinese empire. The same thing happening, of course, with the well-educated Devcharme boys in the Ottoman Empire, and literate bureaucrats becoming important too in Western European states also. How else did the rulers of these empires, whoever they were, both maritime and land, establish their power and legitimacy? Well, this portrait of King Louis XIV of France, ruler of the Kingdom of France and the French Empire stretching into the Americas, reminds us a lot of it had to do with using art and religious ideas to legitimize their rule. Like if you are a king, I mean, he's doing kind of two things at once here in this portrait. He hired a dude to paint him looking like an old Roman emperor, right? So he's saying, I'm the successor to the great European rulers of the past. But also, look, there's a Christian angel putting that sort of laurel wreath on his head there too. And if that doesn't make it look like God wants him to be ruler, I don't know what does. King Louis XIV, also a big proponent of the use of monumental architecture to establish his power. He built that huge palace called Versailles. You can still visit outside of Paris today. And you might recall, he made the aristocrats of France, his rival elites, he made them come live at the palace with him most of the time. So he could literally keep an eye on them and make sure they weren't getting uppity. He was a big proponent, Louis XIV, of this idea of the divine right of kings, that of course kings deserve to rule and have power because it was God who had chosen them to be the kings, he said. And this was echoed, of course, by the claim the Ottoman sultans made in the Ottoman Empire that they deserved to be the rulers and they deserved to have power because they were the caliphs. They were the descendants or the successors to Muhammad as God's chosen leaders of all of the world's Muslims. So religious legitimacy is a continuity from earlier eras in terms of how rulers and leaders claim to have the power they deserve. Some examples of monumental architecture, again, those Ottoman mosques like the Suleymaniye Mosque, the palaces built, those massive palaces built in Europe in this time period by rulers like Louis XIV. I built one too, says Peter Romanoff. So, yep, that's true also. And some other similarities too. It costs a lot of money to buy all that gunpowder weaponry and hire all those bureaucrats and build those palaces and mosques and temples and so forth. And these successful empires were also pretty clever about finding ways to get that money. Tribute collection. Here we see a picture from the time period, of Yasak, that form of tribute collection of valuable furs used by the Russian rulers as they expanded their empire east into Siberia. Tax farming, you might recall, employed by the Ottomans and by the French, this way that you hire people to be tax farmers. Before you can hire your own bureaucrats, you give people the right to private individuals to go out and harvest taxes from the people you've conquered and then pay you a portion of that. All kinds of other innovative tax collection systems to generate the money required to run empires like this. Kind of another similarity of these empires. And finally, the way that these rulers, as I've mentioned just in the last few minutes, had to find a way to reduce the power of older political and economic elites. How, if you're the Mughal rulers, do you keep the Hindu princes that you've conquered? How do you keep them in check? How, if you're a European king, how do you keep the aristocrats in check in an area of the world where aristocrats traditionally had a lot of power? And we've seen some creative images or ideas for that too. The way Akbar the Great encouraged the Mughal rulers and elites to intermarry with the Hindu elites to help that out. The way the Ottoman sultans established the janissaries and the civil service through the Devcharme system as a counterbalance, personally loyal to him, to the power held by the Turkish aristocrats. Or again, here he is, King Louis XIV himself, surrounded by those aristocrats that he made come live in his palace with him to keep an eye on them and keep them in check. One other thing. Imperial conquest often, even as the power of old elites declined, led to the formation of new elites, those janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, for example, bureaucrats in the Ottoman Empire. Or in Spain's American Empire, with its tradition of intermarriage between the European newcomers and the Amerindians, especially the Amerindian elites. Again, those Spanish conquerors also encouraged the new Spanish conquistadors to intermarry with Mexica and Inca elite families. And that led to the establishment of this famous castas system in Spanish America. Here's one of those famous castas paintings there, with the European husband, his Amerindian wife, and their daughter there, who is, of course, a mestizo. And all of them are going to have their different level of privilege there, depending on their racial ancestry or their heritage there, with Europeans on the top, Amerindians on the bottom, and the mestizos there kind of in the middle. A new system of elites there. Or in, as I mentioned earlier, in the Manchu Empire or Qing Dynasty China, the way that the Manchu rulers created various rules and policies to keep them in a position of power and status in the new empire they established as well. Of course, not everyone likes being bossed around by new imperial rulers, so another similarity between these empires, whether land-based or maritime, was that they faced resistance from various distinct social, political, and economic groups they ruled. Back in December, you might recall, we did some primary source work with one of the most interesting stories in American history, or history of places that became the United States, here in New Mexico, the Pueblo Revolt. You remember, as an example, the way that by the 1600s, New Mexico had become the northern fringe of Spain's American empire. But by that point, the pushiness with which the Spanish were trying to convert people to Catholic Christianity, and the greed with which Spanish colonists had taken over the land of the native people there, had led to a revolt led by this guy here, Pope, who's represented in the United States Capitol building as one of the two great historical figures of the state of New Mexico here, who in the 1680s rallied the Pueblo people, the Amerindian people of the area, to rebel against Spanish rule, and it worked. For 12 years, they actually succeeded in kicking the Spanish out of New Mexico and ruling it once again independently before they were finally reconquered. But this is a good example of how a distinct social group, the Pueblo people, were formulated a resistance to their new conquerors. But another form of resistance within these empires, especially American ones, that we cannot ignore, were the massive numbers of slave revolts and rebellions that happened throughout the Americas, where enslaved peoples would sabotage or openly rebel against the slave system that they were within, and the empires that created the Atlantic slave system. And in fact, as you might recall, hardly a year went by between the year 1500 and the year 1888, when slavery was finally abolished in Brazil, when a massive slave revolt did not happen somewhere in the Americas. Of course, only one of them ever worked fully, but that's a story for the next era. Our last big story, and the smallest one, is the story of changes in the way people worked in this time period. And as the College Board says, although the world's productive systems continued to be heavily centered on agriculture, major changes occurred in agricultural labor, the systems and locations of manufacturing, gender and social structures, and environmental processes. So this is kind of what we're looking at here, changes in work, both agricultural products and the goods made from them. And here's a good made from, here's a material made from an agricultural product. Of course, you know, we're looking at calico, that nice printed cotton cloth from South Asia, here to remind us that peasant and artisan labor continued and intensified in many regions as the demand for food and consumer goods increased. Calico cloth became widely popular in many parts of the world in this time period. In Africa, in Europe, and the Americas, people really liked to make their clothes out of this brightly colored and comfortable new textile out of India. No wonder so many Indian peasants started working even harder to grow even more cotton plants to produce even more goods to sell. And no wonder so many Indian artisans, like spinners of thread, weavers of cloth, and dyers who created the colors, no wonder they worked harder than ever before to produce more of the cloth that became more valuable to sell to European traders in the Dutch and British East India companies, and to the local merchants, and to the Arab and Persian and Malay traders who were still trading goods like this throughout the Indian Ocean region. That, of course, making goods to sell rather than to use yourself, we call commercialization, and that was a big part of the story here in our time period, 1450 to 1750, the increase, even more so than before, of commercialization. Especially in the Americas, old forms of coerced labor intensified and new forms of coerced labor came into practice. And in terms of old forms of coerced labor, you'll recall that the Inca state, the Inca Empire, before Spanish conquest, had already had in place this system called mita, where they would have their subjects mita in certain places of the empire to do certain forms of work, road building or bridge building on those awesome Incan roads that connected their mountainous empire, or work on the farms owned by the Incan government, the Incan state, the sun farms, to produce the food surpluses they needed, growing potatoes and maize. And when the Spanish took over, of course, they continued that system, only now they made their new subjects in the newly conquered Incan Empire, which became the Spanish colony of New Granada, work more doing things like this, mining that silver out of the ground in places like Potosi. So that was a thing that happened too. Old forms of coerced labor intensified. The new forms, though, this you might remember, a portrait of an encomendero, one of the new Spanish colonists, coercing some labor in this graphic primary source image from one of the Amerindian residents of his encomienda, or this plot of land given to him by the Spanish government to control and to use for economic production, maybe of a cash crop, maybe of mining, maybe of ranching. But this is what the Spanish did, of course. As you remember, after conquering the New World, conquering places like Mexico, they gave much of the land to Spanish settlers as encomiendas, these plots of land where the encomenderos had the right to use the Amerindians there as coerced labor, much like the feudal system of Europe from earlier. These guys were kind of like the serfs in that system. They had to do the work that the encomendero told them to do, or else. So that was a new form of economic production. And of course, chattel slavery as well was our another part of new coerced labor in the Americas in this time period. Though domestic slavery was something of a continuity in many parts of the world as well. Hey, there we go. Look, it's Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of the Ottoman Empire, and he has something to say to us. What you got, Suleiman? Oh, thank you. Well, there you go, folks. Hope this was helpful, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.